Can we call the meeting to order and ask for a roll call, please?
Director Sethi,
Here.
Akbari,
Here.
Gunther,
Here.
Huam, here, and Weed.
Here. Have a salute to the flag. Please join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic that
stands one nation
under God,
indivisible,
invisible,
with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you. We have some comments to be made by the general manager related to a Zoom meeting, and then move into public communications. So, thank you.
Thank you, President Wade. Just some housekeeping remarks, just to welcome everybody. Good afternoon on behalf of the Alameda County Water District Board of Directors. I'd like to welcome everyone's participation in this special meeting of the ACWD Board. My name is Ed Stevenson. I serve as the district's general manager. Members of the public may participate in this special board meeting by either using the Zoom app or by telephone. If you are participating via Zoom, we ask that you mute your microphone unless you're speaking. You may also be placed on mute by the Assistant District Secretary. The Assistant District Secretary will unmute participants at the appropriate times when the board is receiving public comments. In Zoom, you'll be able to view presentation materials as they're presented to the board. At any time, raise your hand in the Zoom app, and we'll be sure to give you an opportunity at the appropriate time. If you are participating by telephone audio, you can download the presentation slides and other materials from the district's website at www.acwd.org. Please put your phone on mute to assure the best sound quality for everyone. And Zoom also allows you to use your dial pad *6 to mute or unmute and *9 to raise your hand. People participating by telephone will also be given opportunities to address the board. This virtual board meeting is being recorded and it'll be made available to the public for future viewing. And President Weed, that completes my housekeeping message.
All right.
General Manager Mr. Stevenson and Board President John Weed, I would like to know who the iPhone participant is on our meeting right now.
So we do have a member of the public, or is that a consultant?
This is I'm a consultant with Brown and Caldwell.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Since that I'm a member of the public, Monica.
All right, thank you, Monica. At this time, we have the opportunity for members of the public to comment on matters that are on this notice of special meeting, which includes climate action change. Do you wish to make a comment to the board, to the group and the board? As a member of the public? If not, then we will close the public comment section and move on to our action calendar, which is item 4. And it involves a cooperative agreement for water transfer and exchange project between Alameda County Water District and the Contra Costa Water District, and related actions and determining the project is exempt from CEQA. So the General Manager, Stevenson.
Yes, thank you, President Weed. And yes, we do have just this one action item on the calendar today, and this will be introduced by our Director of Water Resources, Laura Heides.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. In response to ongoing drought conditions, the district has developed an agreement to transfer up to 5,000 acre-feet of water from the Contra Costa Water District. This transfer involves Contra Costa purchasing transfer water under the Yuba Accord in either the spring or summer of 2022, storing that water in Los Vaqueros Reservoir, and then transferring an equal amount of CCWD Central Valley Project water via exchange to the district during the transfer window of 2022. The district cannot directly receive springtime transfers as our deliveries are dependent on the state water projects, which restricts transfers to the transfer window. Contra Costa is uniquely able to acquire the springtime water because of its ability to divert directly from the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta, and because of the availability of storage in Los Vaqueros Reservoir to store the water until the transfer window opens and the district can receive the water using state water project facilities. The district will reimburse Contra Costa for the purchase, conveyance, and storage costs it accrues in the acquisition and delivery of the water to the district. The purchase cost of the springtime and summertime transfer water is $500 per acre foot and $600 per acre foot respectively. Staff estimates the total cost, including conveyance losses and Contra Costa facility charges, to be approximately $980 per acre foot or $1,135 per acre foot respectively, and upon delivery totaling up to $5 million. As an extraordinary dry year expense, money has not been previously budgeted for this expense and will require a reserve appropriation. Due to the extremely poor water supply conditions caused by 3 consecutive years of drought and corresponding low availability and high cost of water on the transfer market, staff has determined that the volume and price of the Contra Costa transfer water is a good opportunity. In addition to being reasonably priced water during a critically dry year, this transfer also has additional value for the district by informing efforts on the Los Vaqueros expansion and the Bay Area regional reliability studies. In addition to an agreement with Contra Costa, the district will file a notice of exemption for this transfer under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. This item has been previously reviewed at the March 2022 Water Resources and Conservation Committee. Board approval of these actions will help meet the district's strategic plan goal 2.1, maintain and enhance sustainability and reliability of local and regional water supplies. Goal 2.2, protect existing imported water supplies. And goal 3.2, ensure cost reasonableness. So tonight's recommendation is by motion to 1, adopt a resolution approving a cooperative agreement for water transfer and exchange project between Alameda County Water District and Contra Costa Water District and related actions, and determining excuse me, that the project is exempt from CEQA. And 2, authorize a reserve appropriation of $5 million for costs associated with implementing the agreement. And we're happy to answer questions on this. Mr. Niser's here tonight and has been leading this effort. So we're happy to answer any questions before the board takes action.
This is an item beyond the board workshop. Is there any public comment on this item at this time? If not, do we have any comment from members of the board?
Yes, from Director Sethi. So first, I support the action item, and I will move it if there's a second. But I will just want to note for the public, 5,000 acre feet of water is a lot of water. In the summertime, we're using 40,000 acre feet or more, and hopefully less this year. So this represents about 10% or more of our continuing water supply. And then I do have a question for Mr. Wunderlich, if he's available here, or somebody from the finance staff.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. What is the cash flow impact to the water district over the next 12 months?
Yeah, so my understanding is that we're looking at up to about $5 million, but assuming that there is the demand for this water, which I think we anticipate, obviously what we would sell it for, this number of acre feet is approximately double what we're paying for it. Now, we will spend some money for water treatment and other processes, but I think, from a net cash flow perspective, the water sales revenue will cover the cost of purchasing this water.
Okay, thank you for that confirmation of what I was already thinking about, but I wasn't sure about it. So thank you very much. And that is the end of my comments and questions.
Director Gunther, I'll comment support and also second Director Sethi's on his motion. I'd like to point out this shows some true value of working interagency, particularly with Contra Costa and the values that we may be able to see in the future. I'd like to thank the staff for the hard work on this one. and showing that we could do it again. Thank you so much, and I has my support.
Thank you.
President Wade, may I?
Please.
I just want to say thank you to staff. This is actually a very innovative agreement. I think this is the second time that we have done it. And it also highlights regional cooperation. And it also actually credit goes to staff for maintaining a really good relationship with Contra Costa, that they kept us in mind when this water is available. My understanding is this was only offered to ACWD because we're in a unique position to take advantage of it. So thank you to staff for working so hard on this and for being so creative. And I will definitely support this project.
All right, thank you. Director Akbari, do you have any comment?
Nothing to add, but I'll be supporting the item.
All right, thank you. I'll be supporting the item, but I would note several nuances in here. At the last drought, we were able to bring in 5,000 acre feet of water from through an exchange with Contra Costa, but it required the signing off by the Bureau of Reclamation. And they held up until the very last minute, and we were keeping our fingers crossed that they would actually sign it. Apparently there was political issues with their agricultural clientele. We have to have an agreement also on this transfer with the Bureau of Rec.
That's a good question, Director Wade. I'm going to ask Mr. Nizer to describe the agreements that are needed and also sort of the level, just to also set expectations about the availability of this water. We're bringing it to the board today because we want to keep this option open, but it's not 100% certain. So Mr. Nizer, do you want to comment on the Bureau of Reclamation agreement?
Sure, I didn't quite hear it, but I believe the question was, is there a Bureau agreement? If that is, it's the same procedure we used in 2014. And Director Wong, this would actually be the third time we've gone through the process. One time the environmental conditions did not allow for the transfer. The two additional actions that are required is that our partners at Contra Costa actually petitioned the Bureau for the change of place of diversion and rediversion of the water as the CVP contractor. So Contra Costa actually submits that request. That process is already under works. Once the Bureau approves that, then we approach Department of Water Resources to receive a conveyance agreement. Just so they can, once the Bureau said, sure, you can do this, they say, okay, fine, we'll move the water through the state facilities. So those are the two agreements, in addition to the notice of exemption that we will file immediately.
Next, it was suggested that we were uniquely situated, but are there not other South Bay aqueduct contractors that could also be equally situated?
There are. What's put us in a unique opportunity is that we are not signatories to the Yuba Accord, whereas say Zone 7 signed the original Accord water. So this is water that is a supplement to the water that has been agreed to for transfer to state water contractors. And part of that original agreement is those members of the Accord, those signatories to the Accord, cannot get the water that's outside of the core transfer water. So it's just a unique opportunity. There's that, plus the fact that we've worked on these agreements together with CCWD in the past, so that the skid has been greased with the regulatory agencies on the process for the transfer. Having previously approved petitions is very helpful when you go to them to say, hey, we'd like to do this, what we did previously and you were fine with before. It makes things move a lot smoother. And because it's a very tight timeline, the spring water officially becomes available as of tomorrow, April 1. And so being able to be nimble and to move quickly and to get an agreement signed and bring it to our board is also sort of a uniquely ACWD quality that not all agencies are able to pull off.
Okay, so additional signatures still to be done, but those hopefully will be more readily received this time than last. The need for storage and Los Vaqueros, is that a critical element of this, since none of the water really will be going to Los Vaqueros? It'll be coming directly to us through the South Bay Aqueduct?
Absolutely. So the two components of the water, there's summer and spring water. Spring water is not permitted for transfer through the biological opinions for the Delta for the CVP and the state project. We cannot take transfer water without a separate petition to the fisheries agencies, which, as you can imagine, would probably take a year. CCWD is not beholden to those biological opinions and is able to purchase the water and divert it and store it in spring months until the time comes when what we call the transfer window opens on July 1st. And then we can use the state facilities to move it to ACWD. So it really is a combination of CCWD having a direct diversion capability from the Delta and having available storage to hold that water until the time when we can take delivery of it. It's actually, I really like to point out that this is a real poster child for a lot of the future flexibility that we've identified in a Los Vaqueros partnership. It was kind of speculative before, but we have this example fall right in our lap, and it's really it's a great opportunity for us for the current dry year, but also to sort of test and exercise this concept that we're considering investing in.
Now, DWR has shown some extraordinary flexibility in this drought, particularly in the operation of Del Val Reservoir. Is there the potential for utilizing storage at Del Val Reservoir for this transfer water?
Not presently. DWR cannot move the water until the summer months. So the restriction is that DWR, the State Water Project, cannot move the water.
But our demand is really in the summer months. And during the summer months, with a more enlightened opinion and operational status of DWR, might we be able to accomplish the same objective?
What would happen in that case, and this is a good opening for an update on this project. If DWR can do that, they will first purchase the water for the benefit of the entire state water contractors, which is by means of an update is actually what's happening.
You cut off. I'm sorry.
With the April 1st availability of water for the spring water. So a small update on this project we received. I'm sorry.
You cut in and out a little bit, but I think you're okay now.
Okay, I may turn off my video for a moment. Can you hear me fine?
Yes.
Okay. The update we received 2 days ago is that DWR is operating in a manner such that they can actually preempt our purchase. They have first right of refusal. They will be purchasing the April water from Yuba. What it's basically an in lieu of releases from Oroville. So DWR will be able to take advantage of April, which is taking the urgency off of getting this signed, agreed to tonight. But May and June are still on the table. So the summary right now is that, and maybe we should have included this in the summary that was read, is that this water is a roll of the dice. It's not a guaranteed availability. It's a binary thing. It either is available in full volume or not available at all. The transfer market in general is drying up as quickly as the Central Valley, and there are not a lot of opportunities out there. But by signing this agreement or being authorized to sign this agreement, we will at least be ready to take advantage of an opportunity should it arise.
This is Director Sethi. I have a couple of questions to Mr. Nizar and Ms. Laura Heides. Ms. Heides mentioned that this is not 100% guaranteed. And so I would like to question, what is our confidence factor in receiving this, which is a significant supply of water? Mm-hmm. And number two, to Mr. Nizar, is this water coming off the Yuba rivers, the North Fork, the South Fork, and or is this coming from the Sacramento River?
I could take all of that if
Go for it.
Okay. Our original number that we had at committee was this water is 50-50. That was revised to 80-20 the hard way for ACWD 2 days ago. So it's diminishing quickly. So no promises. The terms of the agreement, however, we have no financial commitments whatsoever unless water's moved. So we're not really venturing. I just want to underscore that. As far as the water, it is sourcing from all forks of the Yuba River. It's actually being released from the lower Yuba River. I think it's New Bullard dam. I forget the exact name of the reservoir, but it's the confluence of both forks.
Mhm. And the payment that we would make, which goes back to my question about cash flow, that will be made to Contra Costa Water District, and over what period of time?
We agreed to monthly billing as the costs are incurred. So if and when they pick up the water, we'll be billed for that water within 30 days, plus the facility charges that they are accruing in the process of
At
picking
close
up.
to $1,000 an acre foot, right?
Correct. At the end of the equivalent volume at the end of the day. Yeah. That includes a fair amount of loss factor for a transfer through the delta. All delta transfers lose roughly a third of their volume.
Okay, and let me ask a very last question. Is it absolutely necessary to go through this exercise with Contra Costa? Are we trying to prove that we can do water transfers at the expense of $5 million? Or do we really need the water? That's the bottom line of what I want to ask.
That's a great fundamental question. No, we have been pursuing water transfers since the beginning of the calendar year. So we're involved in 2 opportunities which were presented to committee, the dry year transfer program through the state water contractors, as well as this opportunity. This is a better price and a better volume if it's available. So it's competitive and actually, I mean, just financially a better The water will be used to offset we just lost 10% of our allocation. So we just lost 4,200 acre feet in our allocation from the state. And it will basically be used to supplement the draw on local storage that's being used this year. And the difference will largely show up as end of year storage. We're going to be below where we'd like to be at the end of the year in preparation for 2023. This will help get us closer to our target carryover storage for 2023. And the reason for that is after three consecutive dry years, we are on track to be the 3rd driest year in our local history. The state is severely depleted in storage. So even if we were to get an average rainfall year next year, we're going to have a very small table A yield in 2023. The probability of getting a good allocation next year is severely diminished by the severity of the storage situation right now.
And I know I'm asking a very particular question, but off your head, do you know what our table A allocation reserve is in San Luis Reservoir?
Oh yeah, it's roughly 10,000 acre feet.
So to meet our commitments for the community for this calendar year, not fiscal year, calendar year, are we projecting that we're pretty much safe, although we have to enforce some water conservation rules on the community?
That is correct. If we can hit our 15% conservation and if we don't get this transfer, we'll be able to meet the demands for the community and have a small reserve left over at the end of the year. And the analogy I typically use in this description is, this is a bit like, imagine we're a hunter-gatherer wandering the plain behind me in the middle of the desert in a drought. You may have a bag with you, satchel full of food. You've got the food you need for the day, but if you come across a piece of food, you're going to pick it up and carry it home with you. And that's really the analogy here. We don't desperately need it this year, but it will be a very comforting thing to have and will prepare us for tomorrow, given the extremely dry state and the low storage with the State Water Project.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm supportive of this item, but I don't want to understate the financial commitment here from the water district of close to $5 million, and that we're paying double the price that we could be paying otherwise. So thank you for the presentation from all of staff here. Thank you.
All right. Other board members have questions? Let me raise 2 more then, if I might. The first, might not the state of California have the ability, as you showed earlier, to preempt our interest and take this 15,000 acre feet and put it into the total of 15,000 acre feet and put it in their dry year transfer program?
The state literally cannot touch this water. unless conditions are just right. And DWR was able to make the April conditions. It's a combination of their flow requirements from Oroville and in the Delta. And if this water is able to offset those flow requirements, what they can do is hold on to supply. And that's the condition that the DWR has been able to set up for April. And that's why they're able to take the water. So they're not going to physically take the water. They're just holding back on releases that can, for flow requirements on the lower rivers that can be met because of this water.
Okay.
So it's a little complicated.
Okay. Then next is the further marketability of the water. If we were to make a $5 million investment, is it an absolute prohibition for us to be able to resell the water at an appropriate administrative markup to another district, particularly within the San Francisco PUC distribution system?
So the original purchase agreement that CCWD has for the Yuba water includes provisions to resell the water to other agencies within the region, and Contra Costa is doing that at cost. We are pursuing this with a interest from the SFPUC on potentially doing a further transfer maybe next year or in a future year when the conditions are right, in order to test some of the regional reliability work. So there is an opportunity. As we said, we're holding on to this water mostly if there's 1,000 acre feet left over, or if it can offset water in semi-tropic in a future year. San Francisco has expressed an interest in looking at a transfer opportunity, so we would recoup some of that expense at that point and achieve some other longer term objectives that the district's trying to do. So there's a lot of knock-on value that would come from this potentially. Are reselling it, to the direct question? To my knowledge, no. This it has provisions tied to the original water right of the water. There may be an opportunity, but since we are in a declared water emergency, any sale of water during our declared emergency has to be done in a manner that is beneficial to our community. So I think that's probably the most direct answer, unless council has an opinion on that.
President Weed, I have moved this item. It's been seconded by Director Gunther. Unless there's any other questions, I would ask that we take a vote.
I actually have a couple clarification questions.
I have clarification. Please go on.
So I'll just make it quick. So first of all, I have the privilege and pleasure of listening to this item, hearing this item in committee. So I just want to clarify my understanding. So first of all, the $5 million will not move unless we can get the water. Otherwise, it's no cost to us. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so the second clarification I need, because there are a lot of discussion, is that this water we're pursuing two options to acquire additional water. And this is actually the cheaper of the two options, correct? This is actually a lot cheaper than buying water on the spot market.
Cheaper and more, yes, and more favorable.
Okay, so overall, this is actually a good deal for ACWD if we could get it, because there is definitely not just water supply, but financial advantage. I assume that's a yes.
Right, yes, that is correct.
Director Wong, may I ask a question? Who would we be buying from on the spot market?
I believe based on the presentation staff has, there are farmers in Central Valley and that would consider selling the water. And Thomas, you need to help me out. And I believe we also have participated in the state's program.
That's correct.
Water, turn back.
The Dry Year Transfer Program is a sort of a brokerage for a number of willing farm sellers. They're called typically the Feather River contractors or settlement contractors who have an assured water right because they were impacted by a construction state water project. Those are the typical sellers. There's anywhere from 12 to 14 in any given year.
Okay, thank you. Yes, there is water to be had for a price. Well, thank you. All right, we have if there are no further comments, as for a call for the vote, please, roll call, please.
Director Sethi,
Yes.
Second, do we have
Yes.
a second?
Moved by Director Sethi, seconded by Director Gunther.
Okay, thank you.
Directors Akbari,
Aye.
Gunther,
Aye.
Huang,
Aye.
and Weed.
Aye. Okay, now we go to the from immediate water needs to our workshop for what to do about climate change. So let me turn this over to the staff. Thank you. Mr. Stevens.
Well, thank you, President Weed. Certainly the future is a big part of this, but I'd say also that we're already being impacted by drastic swings in hydrology. And so we know we need to be prepared for what's in our future. So this is an effort to be prepared for that upcoming reality. And so I'll turn it over to our Director of Water Resources, Laura Heides, to get us started.
Thanks, Mr. Stevenson. Staff is really excited to be here tonight to cover this topic and talk about the development of an ACWD climate adaptation plan. I know the district's been doing planning over the years and different projects and integrating climate in different ways, but we're really excited to be here tonight to really be focusing in on this topic, I think for the first time. So here with you with the board. We've got a great team here tonight that I know Mr. Nizer is going to introduce here in a bit. Excited to have them all here. And also I just want to acknowledge that this is really a cross-departmental effort that basically touches every corner of the district. And so this is a collaborative effort, and we're appreciative of all the different departments and team members that have been participating. So I just wanted to express that appreciation tonight before we get started. So with that, I know there's a lot to cover and some great introductory information coming. So I'm going to turn it directly over to Mr. Nizer, who's leading this effort, to introduce the team here tonight and get us started.
Thank you. And Laura, I couldn't help but notice there's no fish ladder in your backdrop. Great. Well, good evening. As introduced, this is a workshop to overview the development of an ACWD climate adaptation plan. Oh, and I will pre-qualify tonight and apologize. I will say climate adaptation probably every time. I mean to say adaptation. It's stuck in my craw. I apologize. We are very excited to be here tonight to get this project underway. As a water resource planner, climate change has been the elephant in the room for an awful long time. And 15 years ago as a society, we were still debating whether or not climate change was even real. And today that conversation's all but ceased, even the biggest skeptics. Climate change is no longer an abstract future reality. Its early effects are here now. Just this year, we've experienced record-setting monthly rainfall numbers from extreme wet to extreme dry, what DWR has referred to as weather whiplash. We've also seen record-setting temperatures, a vanishing snowpack, literally, and record wildfires. And as I mentioned, ACWD is currently on track to be in its third driest 3 consecutive year period in our 150-year record. So since 1871, our records indicate this 3-year period is on track to be the driest. And this is just the beginning. In 2021, the International Panel on Climate Change published a report that included a number of very solid conclusions, starting with that the Earth is warming faster than we'd previously estimated. So the work that's been done to date is already insufficient. And that many of the changes, in particular sea level rise, have already been set in motion. We've gone through what's called a weather window, where even if we were to take corrective actions for 100 or 1,000 years, we couldn't reverse some of these effects. So the question is, what can we expect next from climate change, and what are we going to do about it? So as we look forward, ACWD is poised to update its water supply master plan. That's the Integrated Resources Plan, or IRP. And that establishes our water supply management objectives and potentially recommend new supplies and capital improvements to be implemented over the next 30 years. In order for that IRP to advance effectively, it's imperative that we first understand how climate change will impact our existing assets, our water supplies and infrastructure, as well as our operations and business practices, so that we can identify and address these critical deficiencies before we proceed with doing any attempt at sound planning. A climate adaptation plan, I got it, will help us do this. A climate adaptation plan, or a CAP, will also assist us with the number of external entities and partners. We've been seeing growing state and federal oversight on us to prepare for climate change, with increased requirements for inclusion of climate change in our urban plan, SIGMA, our hazard mitigation plan, our large water system reports, financial audits, and just this month, the State Water Board has initiated a basin plan amendment to include the effects of climate change on declining water quality as a part of the basin plan. And finally, we need a document that's going to capture all of this technical and regulatory information for communicating to our customers in an accessible format. It's very complex stuff, and it has profound impacts on our core business, and our customers deserve to know what those impacts are and how we're dealing with it, how we are preparing for it, and how we plan to deal with it. So therefore, the climate adaptation plan will include both a technical, but also a very public-oriented, public-facing document. So I don't want to paint this picture that the district's been doing nothing in this regard. We've been focused on this for quite a long time, and staff has been very active on multiple fronts, preparing for and keeping climate change in the fore. And that includes addressing emerging regulations for climate change in our planning processes, formation of an interdepartmental climate adaptation team, which has not only begun the informal vulnerability assessment, but also identified some potential adaptation measures and is a lead off for some of the work that you'll be hearing about tonight. And that team was also really key in collaboration to prepare the RFP for the work here, interviewing climate specialists and reviewing state, federal, and non-governmental guidelines and recommendations for how to develop a plan like this. We're on the leading edge. Not a lot of water agencies are where we are today. And I would like to shout out, the whole core team is actually here, so I would like to call out Ava Laser, Kelsey Oshiro, Devin Becker, and Megan Marino for a lot of good hard work and a lot of passionate work that's come done to date. And then, of course, I also want to compliment the board. In 2019, this board adopted as an interim planning objective climate readiness as a criteria for our planning work in a lead up to that 2025 IRP. So the development of a CAP will bring all of these tendrils together into one cohesive plan, and that we will make sure that that aligns with both local, state, and regional plans. We'll focus our planning efforts, our future investments, make sure we don't pursue things that are bad investments, and prepare us to apply for funding for those future investments. I'm very excited to introduce the team we have here tonight. We had a real robust RFP process. We had some great applications, and we have a great team here from Brown and Caldwell. I'm sure the board will agree that we've assembled a fine team. I'd like to just introduce them at the top here. Our project manager is Dr. Tess Sprague, who is Brown and Caldwell's Climate and Resilience Lead, and she advises public and private sector clients on climate risk, resilience, and vulnerability assessments. Dr. Sprague is a teacher, researcher, and author of Building Resilience and Planning for Extreme Water-Related Events. And as a side note, she's also the project manager for the Bay Area Regional Reliability SWAP study that we're doing. So she's very familiar with the region. And then assisting her is Katie Ruby, who some of you may know. Miss Ruby is a water resource engineer specializing in integrated resource planning and climate resilience. Miss Ruby is well-versed in urban supply planning, a bonus for us, alternatives analysis, drought contingency planning, and risk and resiliency assessments to strengthen water supply reliability in the face of climate uncertainty. And Ms. Ruby also serves as the deputy executive director for CUA, so is very well connected with the policy makers and trend sort of opinion leaders that we need to be reflecting in the work that we're doing here. Next slide, please. So in summary, and this is really for posterity, I'd like to hit the reporters' questions, the who, what, where, and why. So why are we here? We're here to discuss how we will study the known and anticipated impacts of climate change on ACWD. What is it that we need as an agency? We need a high-level assessment and an understanding of our vulnerabilities to climate change before we can do any real planning. Why do we need this? So that we can understand the risk of inactions and we can plan appropriately. Okay, what is this not? Much of the past couple decades has been a discussion of mitigation planning and climate action, which has been more geared towards reduction of greenhouse gases and attempting to offset the increase in pressure on climate change. A noble goal, but that's not what this study is. This study is to address how climate change will impact us. And finally, who will do the work? We have a great team assembled. They've done this before. We see no need in taking away the job from the bread bakers, but they will be working closely with the district's climate adaptation team in terms of areas of focus and emphasis and assumptions that are most relevant to ACWD to make sure we get the best product we can out of this effort. And with that, I will hand it off to Dr. Sprague.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you for the kind introductions. I'm going to run through our workshop agenda real briefly here, and we've modified a couple of our interactive pieces, but we'll speak to that in a moment. So what I'd like to do is just take a quick walkthrough of what we're going to be going over today and sort of pause to give a note, a heads up to where we're going to have a little more interactive component. So we're going to start off with the workshop goals. Just make sure we're all on the same page with what we're trying to accomplish with our time here today. Katie Ruby is going to be starting us off with that piece, and then we'll go through a bit of background, some general context. I think most of us here are probably quite familiar with and are have been listening to some of the contextual pieces that have been communicated by Thomas and others, and so that'll reaffirm some of those bits and data points. And then one of the pieces here we want to talk about is again a reiteration of alignment with other efforts, where we see that connection between regional and also state efforts, and making sure that we maintain that alignment moving forward. We'll pause a bit at the end of that section just to make sure if there are any questions for clarification, that we've got just a moment of pause for that before launching into our objectives and scope. And in that section, we'll get into also a point of a bit of discussion. Really, we want to make sure we provide an opportunity for some commentary from the board on the objectives and priorities for this phase 1 project. And then we'll provide that overview of scope. That'll lead into our study methodology, where we're going to briefly review some of those key pieces of how we're going to be doing this work. And we'll have a couple of places in that portion where we'll have another round of input, and we'll give some instruction as we approach those pieces to kind of give a heads up of what we're looking for and sort of how we're setting up that sort of ask of information. And then at the end here, we'll round out with what's coming up next. This is an ongoing process for the work. And of course, we've got our board question and answer and time for public comment as well. Throughout this time, if folks have a comment that they would like to provide, we'd encourage using the chat function in the Zoom, just using the Zoom chat so we can keep track of that, and also to raise a hand if possible. All right, without further ado, we'll go to our first question for the group. And this is really for everyone, members of public and also board members alike. And that's really what kind of words is more of an icebreaker type question. I'm sure folks on this call have a variety of words they would like to use and describe for climate change risks, but what are some of the key words that immediately come to mind when you think of climate change risks in general? And for that, if folks, actually, I think if we don't have a raise of a hand, we can also have some shout outs if folks feel so bold. We'll have a timer on that. So if you've got maybe a minute or two. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'll go sea level rise.
All right. Yep. Sea level rise is a big one. Anyone want to reaffirm that one, or is there something else that seems a little more pressing?
Yes, Delta disaster.
There you go.
Drought and wildfire.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually gonna say similar persistent droughts.
Extreme weather.
Mm-hmm.
a certain level of unpredictability as well.
Okay, got
I,
Ken also had a comment there. Ken will capture that comment.
okay, well, I think we've come to the realization that it is that the climate change is for real. It's continuous. Not continuous. It's with us. Mitigation has been expensive, problematic, noble, and futile. It's going to happen anyway. So we wasted a lot of money on mitigation and time and energy. But at least we're addressing adaptation in the changing environment, and that's a positive.
All right, well, I'm glad that you provided that input because we are definitely not focused on mitigation for this effort. So I'm happy to report that in response to that input.
We have one other threat, which is environmental rules and regulations driven in much part by an anti-growth agenda. And that becomes another issue that overlaps on this. But the climate change aspects with sea level rise, more severe droughts, which I would call a contingency because they're episodic, they're not continuous, are important.
President Weed and staff and other board members, there is an article this week in most of the major newspapers about the breakage of a significant ice shelf off of Antarctica. And the winter temperatures right there are 75 degrees above normal. They're 50 degrees above normal in the Arctic. And they're estimating that if the Antarctic east shelf deteriorates significantly more, that would result in 160 feet rise in sea levels. Imagine that, 160 feet. And Thomas Friedman wrote an article about this in the New York Times. And this is not 3 feet, 6 feet, 10 feet, or 12 feet. This is 160 feet before the end of the century. This is stuff to really worry about.
Well, not before the end of the century, I don't believe, but it would still be, it's still a major, over history and geological times, you've seen a 300-foot change as evidenced by our groundwater basins during each of the ice ages. So we've seen major sea level changes.
And you're correct, Director Weed, because that's why we find so much prehistoric sea life over in Calaveras Reservoir.
Yeah.
So it might answer this question. So if the question is specific to impact to Alameda County Water District, then instead of more global as we have been answering, then I would say water shortage due to drought, impact to Alameda Creek flow fishery water supply due to drought, saltwater intrusion that would impact our groundwater basin due to sea level rising, movement of contaminated groundwater through sea level rising in our water basin, and infrastructure impacts. We do need to retool or relocate some of our infrastructure, including well locations. Yes, I did my homework.
Okay, thank you. All right. I'll ask this, our presenter, if we have checked off item 1.
Yes, I believe we have. My apologies. I thought I was off mute trying to bring us back to our presentation here. So thank you for that. But these are great inputs. And I saw Monica from a member of the public here. You've also provided input in the chat, so we'll make sure to document that as well, just acknowledging that. But I think this is great. We've got some notes here. Some of the feedback you'll see sort of reaffirmed and reiterated as we move through the slides here and get to some other examples of impacts and how we're approaching.
Hey, Tess, I would add one more thing from my end.
Sure.
And that is the California snowpack, because that's our mountain reservoir.
Right. And that's part of looking at the whole system and that all the way up in terms of the supply side reliability as well. So tracing that, but thank you. We'll note that as well. All right, we're going to keep moving forward here with our introduction pieces, and I'm going to turn things over to Katie to go through our workshop goals before providing that brief bit of background. Katie, take it away.
Excellent. Thanks, Tess, and good evening, everyone. Thomas did a great job kind of setting the stage and framing up the bigger picture goal of this work and why we're here today. As far as the goals for this workshop specifically, we want to provide an overview of some of the best practices, industry standards, and considerations that will be guiding this work. We'll also present an overview of the scope and methodology, as well as confirm objectives and priorities for the CAP. And as Thomas mentioned up front, a lot of scope and objectives have been framed up really well already as part of the RFP for this project. I know that staff put a lot of thought up front in framing this. So the goal for today is really to align and solicit input from the board and the public before we really dive into the bulk of this study. And one other thing to note too is that this is just, kind of a first step or initial phase as part of the district's broader IRP update process. And there will be opportunities for additional public input as part of that. So consider this kind of the first step in a longer journey. So as we all know and have discussed, our climate is changing. And as shown on this map, the impacts of climate change can look different in different regions. That said, there's also a broad range of impacts that can be experienced in any given area. So in California, as we were just discussing, I think, we're all acutely aware of severe drought conditions and wildfire and even sea level rise. But we're also susceptible to heavy rains and flooding and other impacts. And so we really need to be prepared for the full range of conditions that could come our way. And here are some examples of how we've seen climate change and extreme events impacting our communities and our infrastructure. And for ACWD, as a district that provides essential water service and as a steward of the natural environment and of your ratepayers, it is really important to prepare and adapt. And we know that the board unanimously agreed to add a climate readiness interim policy objective, and that is really what this work is about. In order to adapt and be prepared, we must first understand where the biggest vulnerabilities are, what are those biggest risks, and that is the main focus of this study. And we want to acknowledge that the district is not alone in this process. There are several state and regional initiatives around climate resilience, such as the Governor's Water Resilience Portfolio, the California Climate Adaptation Strategy, and also city and county climate action plans locally. So we are tracking these initiatives, and as part of this study, we'll be identifying opportunities for alignment as well as opportunities for regional collaboration. And one part of alignment that Thomas alluded to early on too is funding opportunities. The state has committed to spending $5.2 billion over a 3-year period for climate adaptation and drought resilience. And so the more aligned the district is with state priorities, which right now are very centered around regional collaboration, the better position you'll be for funding down the road. So we have listed several opportunities for regional collaboration in this right box here. So water supply planning is obviously a big one, as well as preparing for sea level rise impacts, flooding, and changes in water quality. And it's not just the physical impacts of climate change that we'll be looking at. We also need to be aware of climate-related regulations and legislation, as was mentioned, that pose risks to the district's resources. So from a water supply perspective, of course, the Bay Delta Plan is a big one. 2018 conservation legislation will be establishing new long-term water use standards. And there are several other anticipated or pending changes that we'll want to keep an eye on. For example, I wouldn't be surprised if future urban water management plan requirements require much more robust climate change analyses. And so this CAP will really help get ahead of those anticipated future legislative and regulatory requirements that are almost certainly coming our way soon.
I have a question here, Tess, from Director Sethi. So the city of San Francisco a couple of years back passed a $50 billion bond, from what I recall, to shore up the waterfront around the Embarcadero in San Francisco and some associated areas going down to the ballpark and everything like that. Will we take into consideration the fact that the Tri-City area is very vulnerable to sea level rise and what solutions might be offered in conjunction with other public agencies, ACWD, USD, the three cities. It seems to me that in the future, we're going to require some kind of concerted effort regionally
Absolutely.
to buffer the bay.
Right. And I think we're going to get to what that in part was what we were trying to communicate with some of the regional priorities and planning. So that's spot on. What we'll do is as we kind of go through, and I think in a couple of slides, we're going to touch on that a bit as well with coordination and alignment with other plans that are in place, because we do understand that there are already climate adaptation plans that have been completed and some that are being updated throughout the Bay Area. So that's something that you see the cities of Fremont, Newark, Union City. We also understand that there are other efforts, including that waterfront resilience plan and that project development that the city of San Francisco and 1SF, if you look at some of their bigger planning efforts too, with the recent plan that they've released, those are also items that we have reviewed and are tracking and are looking for alignment opportunities within. So as a short answer to your point and question here, it's a point well taken. It's one we've been considering, and I think we'll have a little more discussion and opportunity for discussion on that farther down the line in this presentation as well.
Can I ask that you add to your list executive orders going back to Obama and then more recently signed by Biden, which gave specific criteria for federally funded projects? And nearly every project now has some type of federal funding.
I'm sorry, could I confirm, was that a comment or a question? I may have not
Well, a
heard that.
request on your looking for your background and where to get develop information on. That you look at they also include executive orders going back to Obama, I think in 2015, to the Biden in last year on climate activity criteria for development that had with specific dimensions and distances for projects that are federally funded, and all of our projects will have some type of federal funding.
So I think if I have heard that question, and I think after this question, we may want to continue moving forward, because we will have a pause in just a few slides as well for some clarification questions. The executive orders that are on the slide for state and regional priorities are a bit more at the state level itself for funding opportunities and for specifying requirements, eligibility criteria for funding opportunities. We are looking at funding opportunities to be matched to adaptation strategies, so that we can understand how closely aligned and what, if we were going to narrow down which funding opportunities to prioritize and which to invest grant pursuits in. We'll try to match those up to try to optimize which funding opportunities are going to be a best fit for the potential adaptation strategies for ACWD.
Right. In addition to the state, my suggestion is you include federal criteria.
Oh, absolutely. That's anticipated. There's FEMA BRIC. There's also the Lift See It. If folks are not familiar with that, that's another federal. So that will be included in the process.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead, Kate.
I should note too, there are several of these slides that have lists of things, including the one on the screen now, and none of these are exhaustive. I'm just going to say that up front because you'll see several lists. And so we wanted to give some examples and do appreciate if there are specific things you want to make sure are included. Do raise that and we'll jot that down too. So speaking of getting ahead, wanted to just point out that early planning efforts do pay off. According to the National Institute of Building Sciences, every dollar invested in risk mitigation has the potential to save up to $6 in recovery. And so while we may not have successfully mitigated climate change up front, taking these steps to plan ahead and mitigate risk to your specific service area and system can really pay off. So this is time and money well spent up front in climate adaptation planning. And I realize sometimes talking about these impacts of climate change can feel a little bit doomsday-like with all of the risks and what we're seeing in the news and everything. But the good news, as Thomas noted up front, is that ACWD is already getting ahead and moving towards climate resilience. The board's foresight to adopt the interim climate readiness objectives, as well as the work that staff has done in doing a preliminary climate risk analysis for the 2020 Urban Water Management Plan and ongoing groundwater sustainability work. These are all steps in the right direction. And so in developing this climate adaptation plan, we will build upon the work that's already been done. And then we'll also seek to be consistent with what other water suppliers in the region are doing. And so this, I think, is what Tess was kind of hinting at earlier, but we have here just some examples of other agencies in the area that are doing climate change planning. And so wanting to make sure we're taking kind of a similar approach as that and using consistent terminology and everything for the public to understand in the region. This schedule here highlights some of the district's other water resources planning efforts underway and how the CAP fits in. So this
I'm in the middle
initial
of a meeting
let's see
right
if we
now.
can mute. There we go. So this initial kind of phase 1 study is shown in that light blue bar under 2022. We'll be completing this over the next 6 months or so, and it will inform future phases of climate change work, as well as informing the IRP update process and other efforts like the demand forecast update leading up to the 2025 Urban Water Management Plan and the SIGMA 5-year update. And at this point, I'd like to hand back to Thomas to see if there's anything he wants to add to the schedule, and then maybe we can take a pause to see if there are any other questions before Tess takes us through the objectives and scope.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Not much to add, just a few points to make. The board will recognize this. This is sort of summarized from what was in the strategic plan on the water supply and reliability initiatives over the sort of 5-year period, and laying out a lot of the significant work ahead of us. The big driver, of course, is the IRP update, and we're really going to be starting that next year. It's a multi-year process. And this, as I mentioned, is really, all of this is building up to updating that IRP. But some of the things this CAP is going to do for us, as Katie mentioned, that Urban Water Management Plan update, we've seen every 5 years increasing requirements for the district to do climate studies. So we'll be better prepared for that, as well as better prepared for doing our demand forecasting. When we get to climate change studies, I emphasize this is phase 1. We really expect that this, in addition to finding our vulnerabilities, is going to point to a lot of the things of like, hey, you guys got to do this if you want to study this harder. One biggie, for example, is data. We don't really have the data we need to do robust climate studying at this point. It requires the use of supercomputers. It's a significant effort to scope and prepare that, and that's kind of where we've been focused for a number of years. But we thought, let's not go jump into something like that. Let's get this assessment done first. So that those climate studies are going to really extend, my guess is for quite a long time past the IRP. And then, of course, to remind the board, other processes, we have our SIGMA 5-year update. SIGMA is almost a poster child for climate adaptation and planning. The requirement being a 50-year timeline just brings to the fore the necessity of considering climate change in that planning. And amongst the backdrop, we've got our startup for our fisheries facilities, and we've got the ongoing developments with the Bay Delta plan. So there's a lot going on that's going to inform that IRP, but this CAP's going to be really supporting a good number of efforts coming up in the next few years.
Mr. Neiser, this is Director Sethi.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question here. Wouldn't it make sense to have all of the Bay Area water districts cooperate in a common study for the climate change risks to the area, so that we leverage all of our knowledge in the region, instead of each agency trying to do their own climate adaptation project?
Director Sethi, it's an excellent question, and one that has been brought up. In fact, we as our district has actually sort of tried to take a little bit of initiative to get the Bay Area IRWM, the Integrated Regional Water Management Plan group, to pursue a common climate study, at least to perhaps generate a common set of data for everyone to utilize. But there is a little bit of herding that goes along with working with all the agencies, their workflows, their budgets, their work plans in terms of what they have as priorities. And to the extent that we can get folks onto some common assumptions, is definitely an objective. We've also been pushing it with the Alameda Creek Watershed Group, where we have a very clearly delineated work group with a common set of interests. There's interest, but it's very hard to move that group collectively. And we don't have, this is a case where we don't have the time to wait for the ideal. While we can continue to push on these discussions, we can't let that ideal stand in the way of us getting done what we need to do in the interim years to do our work. So hopefully with the leadership of Brown and Caldwell and their expertise, we will be at least building from a common core of assumptions. We will be using the same fundamental assumptions that even if we're all doing different studies, will be built on the same core assumptions and ultimately have compatible results. And Tess, would you like to speak to that?
Well, let me make a quick comment that from previous observation, going back decades now, the limiting factor here, and I'm going to say something very apolitical, it is the egos of different agencies that get in the way of having a common project done together. And so I hope one of the results of this study is a firm recommendation that outlines how we can move forward in some common denominator among all agencies, the 9 Bay Area regions, county regions of the San Francisco Bay Area, where we are trying to enlighten all other agencies. Here's how we can get it done. We know we've done it with the Alameda Creek Fisheries Work Group. That took a lot of effort and overcoming a lot of egos. So if that's one of the results of this study, I would really appreciate that. Thank you.
And thank you. And that comment is definitely one that, and just to kind of add to what Director Seppi said, and also Thomas, what you had talked about with just some of the, this is a process. It's not necessarily an easy process, even within an agency, depending on how siloed different groups are, how far along a vulnerability assessment might be, whether or not that agency has had to do a risk and resilience assessment, what sets that precedent, and what's already been established, even at that individual level. And then if you take that and compound it, I'm thinking of the Bay Area Regional Reliability DCP and how that was a tremendous effort to really bring everyone together and be able to come up with that drought contingency plan and represent different agencies and what their triggers and thresholds were for different levels of drought. And what types of projects, could come down the line from that. And then when we look at some of the other work with BAR, it really is, aligning on, and that's going to be, if we go to our next slide, actually looking at those key definitions, as we start to get into that objectives and scope, what I want to pause here and just point out is that even agreement on terminology, how are we using the word vulnerability? How are we using the word resilience? Having an agreement on how we use these terms across different agencies, what that means in terms of planning processes is also a key starting point. And what I want to kind of, continue as we're looking through, presenting even just this work and moving towards how this work is also in the future going to help with greater collaborations, greater partnerships, opportunities for that, is really making sure that we've got that core foundation of understanding. So in keeping, moving here, but also in sort of continuing the flow of how are we putting these pieces together in a way that's going to continue into the future in a way that's going to help reaffirm and help establish partnerships. We've got a couple of key items that we can come to an agreement on what these mean, because I'm sure that some of the folks on this call have seen a wide variety of definitions for some of these words. So here, I just want to point out, where we're taking the source of this. That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That was the group that Thomas had mentioned in the forefront, who had released their AR6, their Assessment Report 6. The Assessment Report 5 has a wonderful glossary. I encourage folks to take a look there. These are sort of a summarized, a small collection of what we would hope to see some common terminology, not just within this CAP, but also looking at working with others in the Bay Area and beyond. And the first one here being understanding what we mean by adaptation. What I want to point out with this definition is that this is about process. It's about a process of really trying to adjust to what impacts we are already seeing and what ones we're expecting from climate change. And the other key piece here is that it's not just all doom and gloom. We're looking at avoiding harm, but we're also trying to identify what are some of the opportunities. Again, looking at potential partnerships also to address and reduce risks overall, and looking at what are some opportunities to, if we're going to retrofit something, if we're going to, update a plan, what are opportunities to do that better? And the next piece to this the next term sort of builds from that, and that's the adaptation strategies. And I want to point out adaptation strategies are here not a specific project. So we're not talking about specific projects. We're talking about general plans of action, which is going to sound a little fuzzier, and it's meant so intentionally, that are going to try to address impacts of climate change. So we're looking at an adaptation strategy may be something that addresses a specific vulnerability. It's going to be tied to that vulnerability and overall risk that we're trying to reduce. And it's going to be what's a range of approaches that we can take, either a mix of policies, different measures that really try to achieve an overall objective of reducing vulnerability to those impacts. So that's what we're looking at with strategies. The last two on here, resilience and vulnerability, are often touted as two sides of the same coin, sometimes correctly, sometimes not. But resilience here, what we're taking that to mean is really the ability, and focused on the word ability here, of a system. You can read system as the ACWD service area, the system itself in terms of operations, or the community within the watershed that ACWD is operating within. But really the ability of that system to be able to cope with any kind of an acute shock, or you'd call drought a slow onset type of a shock, or general disturbance, and really be able to not just keep its function, but be able to also continue to learn from that disturbance or that shock, and improve over time, enhancing our adaptive capacity. That vulnerability piece at the bottom here, what we're looking at is, kind of the flip side. We know that there are certain parts of the system that are going to be maybe more predisposed based on certain characteristics, aging infrastructure, for example, to be more adversely affected by different climate impacts, different climate risks. And so the lack of ability to cope is what feeds into that vulnerability. If we click one more, further, awesome. That greenhouse gas mitigation, we're just flashing that up here as another reminder. We're aware of this definition. It is important. This is, of course, not the focus of what we're looking at here. We're focusing more on identifying those vulnerabilities. This would be beyond the scope of what we're looking at with this current cap. So
Tess, here is again Director Sethi with a comment.
Okay.
A two-part comment. One, the city of Fremont, I'm not really sure about Newark and Union City, but I do know for the city of Fremont, in which I grew up in, we have a climate sustainability commission, and as I look over the work of this commission since they were set up, the one thing that is dramatically missing is the emphasis on the earthquake hazard to the Hayward Fault.
Okay.
And as I keep repeating in the community in my presentations, the Hayward Fault, going back 2 millennia from what scientific studies show, has had a major 7.0 or greater earthquake every 90 to 165 years. And right now we are in year 154, where the average is 140. So the USGS says that the greatest earthquake vulnerability in the United States is on the Hayward Fault that cuts through our entire district from the northern part of our service area to the southern portion. And so that's where a lot of the vulnerability is to our system and the conveyance of water from the east side of the fault to the west side. So that needs to be taken into consideration. And we need to, I would think that as part of this study, you need to look at what the three cities are doing in terms of their outlook on sustainability, because I don't think they're being very realistic about the risks to what can happen to our three communities that we service. I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you, Director Sethi. I'll just make a very brief comment on that. I think what we may do is add that to, we are keeping a parking lot list of items as well. Parking lot meaning not to be left there, but to be picked up immediately after this presentation, and we may have some, some follow-up questions to address. Seismic risk, given that the focus of our climate risks, at least in terms of primary risks, is going to be changing hydrometeorological conditions as a primary determinant for what the climate risk is going to be kind of how we're setting that up and identifying vulnerability, at least in terms of climate risk. Now, seismic risk within the area is, of course, of utmost importance. And I'm aware of that USGS sort of quotable there, but I do understand that that's going to be something that we would think of as a compounding variability, where if you were going to look at a scenario and you were going to combine a seismic risk with some of the other climate risks, that's something that would be taken into account in terms of a compound vulnerability looked at for scenario development. So I'll pause there with that. I think we can come back to that. It's an important point, and we definitely will be looking at the work and the caps, especially from the other cities as well. And if we can, I think it will be good to look at some of these objectives, because we're coming back to what some of the the objectives and priorities for the work, including how we're addressing and approaching vulnerability and risk. So just looking at for this slide here, there is a difference we're making between objectives and priorities. You can think of objectives as a little bit more the umbrella term, and that's really thinking about what is the purpose and intended outcome. Again, for this phase 1 study, this is not the purpose and objective of everything that ACWD is going to be doing related to climate, mitigating climate risks. And when I say mitigating, I mean risk mitigation, not the greenhouse gas, just to put an emphasis on that. I mean, the priorities are a little more the how-to. And so what we're looking at here in terms of the first objective is, again, we've talked about this quite a bit, alignment across planning efforts. You can look at that as sort of two-phased in terms of alignment within the district across some of the district's policies, initiatives. Can we take a look at those initiatives and policies with a climate lens? Are there some recommendations we can make to make these more cohesive within that lens? And then also, and this gets back, I think, to Director Seppi, your points as well about external plans, policies, initiatives. How do we align with that? We're drawing some boundaries there to make sure we're keeping this feasible within a 6-month period in terms of the scope of what we're looking at, but definitely the cities and neighboring agencies, and of course within the Bay Area, some of the major planning efforts we want to take into account, including sea level rise assessments across the Bay. And then one point to mention here is this includes also the regulatory drivers and impacts in terms of looking at alignment, again, getting back to some of the funding pieces. If we go to the next item, the next objective here, really trying to characterize what are we looking at when we're talking about vulnerability and risk, both the physical and the regulatory pieces of that, identifying both of those, understanding what are the impacts and capacities that the district has already been building, frankly, for a number of decades, thinking of the groundwater management since ACWD's inception. And then also looking at you'll notice identifying impacts of disadvantaged communities. And what I wanna highlight here is that ACWD's role is one that is a collaborative role. So this is not a land use planning agency entity, but ACWD does provide information on what's going on with that sort of the water and community interface. And it's not within this study understood that ACWD is an isolated actor in terms of trying to solve all impacts to disadvantaged communities, but as a member of a bigger group and one that would be collaborating in the future as well. So if we go to that third item here, that objective to prioritize actions for climate readiness, really what we're looking at here are what are some of the goals, understanding that baseline of our vulnerabilities. What are some of the goals we might want to achieve? How do we apply some of the best practices that are out there? And what can we identify as some different strategies to address a host of risks and vulnerabilities that we're looking at, and thinking through this in a way that is a flexible and adaptable approach. Well, I was going to use the word adaptive. I'm sure we're going to come up with that word a few more times, even if I'm using that. But and one of the things to focus on here is that we're looking at near and long-term actions. There's some low-hanging fruit. There are no regrets, low regret strategies we want to focus on. And also, again, look at funding options. The last item, and what squeezes just at the bottom of this slide, is the communication piece. So what we're doing within this phase 1 is really building up that knowledge base, that understanding of what the vulnerabilities and risks are across the service area, and also being able to put that together, as Thomas mentioned, in a way that helps facilitate and helps provide that informational input for continued collaboration with the public facing side of how this is moving forward, and also looking towards the more more in-depth public participation process that you would find with the IRP and other planning efforts. So again, identifying phase one and setting this up to help communicate those transparent outputs. So with that, a bit of a monologue there, my apologies. We wanted to pause here and just ask the board if there are any questions or comments they may have on the list of objectives and priorities we've got.
Hi, Tess. Director Sethi again. I don't mean to hog the podium here, but I do have a point to make on your bullet point number 2, subpoint 2.
Okay.
Document anticipated impacts and adaptive capacity of district supplies, infrastructure, and operations. And this is where I think that the seismic vulnerability to our community is very much an important component of what we're trying to figure out, because when you ask the questions at the origin of your presentation here, what we thought about climate change, I mentioned the Delta. The Delta's doomed. We know that. And if this major quake that's upon us on the Hayward Fault occurs, we know from at least 1868 that seawater went all the way up to Sacramento, up into the Sacramento River, all the way down to Tracy. We will lose a major portion of our water supply. That's 40% of our water supply comes through the Delta. And so I consider the intimacy of climate change along with seismic vulnerability very much linked in. Climate change may be occurring over the next 100, 200 years, over decades, right? But we know the imminence of a major quake on the Hayward Fault and the damage that does to our district water supplies, infrastructure, and operations. Your subpoint bullet 2 there. And so I think that maybe I'm crossing boundaries here, but in my mind, I link these events very closely with one another. Sea level rise is damaging the Delta at the same time that a major impact from a quake can happen. And then we've got salt water all the way down to Tracy where our state and federal pumps are. And no ability to get water, fresh water, to Silicon Valley, which is, the major economic center of the state. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Do other board members have questions or comments?
Yes.
Let me add several then. It strikes me that hopefully one of your objectives and priorities will be to establish some design criteria for the district. The federal government in January 2015 had an executive order which talked about 500-year floods for federal projects, a 3-foot sea level rise. Those are specific numbers we can put into our planning documents that are not there now. We need to identify who's responsible for what. The primary problem with sea level rise is flooding. We don't do flood control. But the city of Fremont, you'll find BCDC, which is responsible, is not protecting much of our district. They're developing a shoreline criteria from the border of Union City to Emeryville for Alameda County because the city of Fremont would not work with them. There's a big gap in the bay for much of our district. There's a major program with federal funding in Santa Clara County. So from Santa Clara County line to the Union City line, it's a big question mark. City of Fremont refused to work with us on a hazard mitigation plan. They failed not only did they downplay some of the seismic risks, they didn't even mention the mission fault, which is even greater threat. They have been pushed and as local cities and their responsibilities, and this includes somewhat Newark and Union City, looking at mitigation, not adaptation. Really big on trying to stop sea level rise, going after a Georgetown award, but didn't go to an adaptation. It was a major failure. So we have some problems. A major part of that with the ecotone levees. When you look at putting in priorities, look at this as a contingency. Desalination is far superior to recycled water. And yet we had a bar program which talks about that. On the Alameda Creek Alliance, I would suggest that's not been a very positive operation for us in the way we've approached it. Water temperature is a major issue with the fish, and that ties into the environmental elements. And much of what we're doing is doomed from the start because the watershed is so warm. We do need to get some storage. We need to get better aqueducts. Resurrection, the Del Val Reservoir is 50,000 acre feet that's built and plumbed, and we're not looking at it. The watershed, the N3 Ranch, another major failure of this district because it could be developed for water supply and water operations. The Niles Canyon Aqueduct. All of those are issues which hopefully will come out of this, your study you're doing. One, the criteria that we can use to do our developments to, and second, some of the curious priorities we've established to date in our water planning.
Mr. Stevenson, somebody needs to manage the presentation. There's very foul stuff coming on across our public meeting right now.
I agree. I think the person who was sharing that screen may have left.
I changed it to host only, so I can go ahead and share it.
Thank you, Ms. Sue.
Don't share the bad stuff.
No. Thank you for.
Well, I've given my soapbox. My 1 or 2 minutes is up. So any other board member wish to make a comment, or is there any member of the staff?
May I?
Please.
So I definitely agree with the policy objective, high-level objectives that has been presented. So thank you very much for a very thorough analysis. I especially like the near-term and long-term, low-hanging fruit and other potential options, and the focus on getting grant fundings and financial assistance. So that's definitely appreciated. I do understand that we are not here to talk about mitigation measures. We're just talking about policy right now. So I agree with this list, and I believe is a really good guide for us to start this path. So thank you.
Thank you. And I understand, Thomas, I believe you've been patiently holding your hand up. I think we should probably come back to you if possible.
Please, Thomas.
Thanks. I think the window may have passed, but what I wanted to kind of take us back to that level. I think Director Wong just did that effectively for us. Director Sethi, I couldn't agree more, and I'm happy to hear that you paid attention to my presentations on the vulnerabilities of the Delta. But we have a huge host, as Director Weed has also pointed out, of vulnerabilities and uncertainties in our planning. Huge. But this effort is to try to focus on one significant component, and one that's very hard to define and very complex. And so what we need to do is keep mindful of, are we talking about something that is going to be exacerbated by a changing climate? For example, the Hayward Fault is going to fail at some point. And the Hayward Fault is not being exacerbated or worsened by a warming climate. That is an independent mechanism. And so where some of this work hopefully will go is it feeds into a hazard mitigation plan.
Mr. Nizar, there are many studies that are suggesting that the earthquakes are being caused by wide variances in temperature between winter and summer. And that's why we have a pattern of earthquakes occurring when the earth warms up and when it cools down. This is scientifically, in the studies out there. So we can debate it later on. But,
okay.
But if we have extreme temperatures that are warming up the earth, it makes seismic events a lot more vulnerable.
Paul, with Director Sethi, everybody, we got a problem. Somebody's typing into the chat box that needs to be taken down.
Right, because
like right now.
Yeah, pause this meeting, President Week, we need to fix this problem because what's being shared should
There's
really
some-
not be on the record.
Yes.
I think we can take a quick break.
All right, we will be back then. And can we make it 5 minutes?
Let's make it 10, please.
10 minutes. Thank you. And thank you for your presentation so far. There you can press got it in order to agree. So 24 participants, welcome. And let me then return it to the presenter to continue your presentation. Thank you, and our apologies.
Tess, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to kind of pick up before we got
Please.
started. But I think Director Sethi's off. But the point is a broader point we're trying to make beforehand, which is we're trying to specifically assess elements that are made more vulnerable by changing weather. So something has to be weather driven. Noted, I can definitely check into whether earthquakes or not. If they are, it's new to me, but let's suppose for a moment it's not, for the benefit of the board. Where this would go in terms of alignment and mitigations would be, we know we have a seismic vulnerability, and let's say we have a climate vulnerability identified at the end of this study. If we can come up with projects for the district to pursue that mitigate and address the vulnerability from this study, climate, as well as that of the seismic vulnerability, now we've got a great synergistic project for the district to seriously consider pursuing. I could give hypothetical examples since we mentioned the Delta. Anything that got us out of the Delta, if we could magically replace our dependence on the state water project with another supply that got us out of the Delta and was not influenced by climate, there's that alignment in our planning, and there's a synergistic solution that addresses multiple hazards for the district. And so I just wanted to make that point about Director Weeds brought in, I'll say, quite the laundry list of planning things, many great things for another discussion. Some of them have climate components. The other thing I wanted to point out for members of the board is that this study is focusing on our existing assets and our existing resources. We're not looking at the vulnerability of future projects or concepts that we're not participating in. That phase will come in when we've added climate readiness as a planning objective. That's the process. So for example, let's say we were looking at, I'm going to say Sites Reservoir north of the Delta. We're not looking at it, but let's say we were pursuing Sites Delta. After this study is done, when we have climate readiness included in our objectives for planning, we would now take a hard look through that lens, amongst many others, at that particular project and say, does this project have its own climate vulnerability? Yes or no? And even if it does or doesn't, does it address some of the existing vulnerabilities that we have? And so that's kind of how we're going to be using the result of this study to inform our planning process. Tess, could you correct me if anything I got wrong there or anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that was a helpful clarification for the focus of the work at hand here. So I really appreciate that. Nothing further, I think, to add to that.
Thomas, do you see this including quantification of that climate change? Height of the sea level rise, the intensity of the floods, the length, was it a 100-year or 500-year flood, and which might be coming more frequently, and things of that nature?
I think that's what the project team will be discussing, is what sort of assumptions will be built in. What are we going to work off of? Are we going to work off of 160 feet of sea level rise or some other index of accepted data? And I'll actually defer to the team. I think they will be kind of going through some of that information.
All right. I would note that there are some of those criteria in some of the documents that were referenced. So a listing of those would be helpful to a future planner.
Absolutely. And I think even just case in point of what are the years that you may be looking at, for example, for Sigma, next iterations of the DWR guidance for climate change analysis inclusion. Currently, there is 1 GCM, for example, that's used for your extreme hazard consideration, and that's extreme scenario, and that's for the years 2030, 2070. If we were going to make a suggestion, such as a policy recommendation, that might be to adjust those years or rely on a different set of data, for example. And that was a key issue staff had brought up already. So we're paying attention to those items.
And it was pointed out by Director Sethi also that if absent some type of a bypass, the delta will become all too soon a seasonal water supply, and then later a lost water supply. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. All right, I think we may keep moving. We'll have more opportunity for comment as we keep going through, and we'll make some pauses. Right now, we wanted to sort of focus on at a high level what the overview of the scope for this, again, phase 1 project is. And really, we're looking at 6 key tasks. The first being the objectives and priorities, establishing those as we've shown in this presentation, and also talking through what are those alignment opportunities, looking at other regional efforts, as well as some of the state initiatives and within the immediate vicinity, even within the service area and the cities operating within that administrative boundary. So looking at establishing and understanding what those alignment opportunities are, and then moving towards that next step of the vulnerability assessment. The goal with the vulnerability assessment is really to gain an understanding of what are some of the most relevant physical as well as regulatory vulnerabilities. And again, as Thomas mentioned, we're looking at the existing infrastructure in terms of especially those physical vulnerabilities, the critical assets, also building off of the RRA work that's been completed with the district's emergency management team. And then taking a look as we go beyond just the vulnerability assessment, also looking at the policy across the district. What are some of the key policies that we can take that climate adaptation lens to, and see if there are some adjustments that could be made, some recommendations of what to consider. And it may be even some references to what kind of guidelines, again, not trying to reinvent the wheel, but build upon best practices that the district can already utilize. There's some cost savings in that as well. So looking at those options, and then that risk assessment really builds off of those previous pieces. And that's really applying and expanding that both policy and vulnerability assessment, and trying to understand what are the most significant impacts, as well as some of the capacities. And part of this is documenting what are some of the capacities that the district has already built upon, again, going back to the sustainable groundwater management over decades, and looking at what's been done there, what the existing capacity already is. This, of course, then turns to what are some of the recommendations when we look at having that understanding of vulnerabilities. We evaluate, prioritize different strategies to try to address and reduce overall risk and address those vulnerabilities. And then all of that together, that leads us to that last task. And that's really trying to package all of that information in a way where we can communicate, here's a roadmap of what are some of the recommendations, considerations, a flexible approach to understand that in a range of potential futures, what are some of those low or no regret strategies that at a given changing condition may be considered for the district, and then looking at their planning process in the future. And if we go to the next slide, we'll look at the general schedule for this project. And again, this being the phase 1, the We Are Here definitely points to our workshop. And we're continuing the vulnerability assessment, looping in some of the policy that we've been reviewing, continuing that, and both of those into the risk assessment. And I'll get to the risk matrix piece of this in a moment. That's a key deliverable here that we're working on, to be able to document in a transparent way how we're understanding and what the resources or references are that we're using to understand what those vulnerabilities are. And then being able to put that together, of course, in the recommendations, and then, of course, into that the CAP itself. What I'll note here is that one of the outputs of this work is also to provide a summary for the public that's in a more digestible, more approachable manner, be a little bit more graphics focused in terms of understanding and visualizing what we mean when we're talking about these key vulnerabilities. And that should provide a useful tool for the district moving forward for future discussions with the public as well. And that leads us to the study methodology, and we'll have, after going through the methodology pieces, we'll have a few points in this section to have some comment as well. And at the very end, we'll come back to the general question and answer from the board, as well as some public input. So just to note that, in case anyone is itching to contribute, there are more opportunities, I promise. So getting through this first piece here, we are looking at, and we are taking an adaptive, and in this case, Thomas, I think it's appropriate for us to use adaptive here, approach toward climate readiness, toward that goal. And when we're considering what we put into this, we're also considering what are the best available industry standards and what's sort of the forefront of where that is. I will say, having spent the last few days in Denver at that AWWA's Water Sustainability Conference that was focused on exactly these documents, that we are able to reaffirm that even within those presentations that we are following exactly that sort of precipice of where those industry standards are and building off of those best practice examples. So the components of this study, some of the key pieces are really identifying what the vulnerabilities are, assessing that risk, prioritizing strategies, and again, working towards that adaptable roadmap. And if we move to the next piece here, what we're talking about with this kind of an approach and thinking through, the why and how, and kind of getting back to, I guess, Thomas, your logic of the media questions here, the why. So why would we take this kind of an approach? Really, we're looking at a great deal of uncertainty when we're thinking about what does the future hold? What are the range of plausible futures that we may want to be considering and planning toward? And really being able to think through a scenario-based approach, which is a bit more bottom-up. That is a better method to utilize when dealing with a high level of uncertainty. So that's part of the why, is really trying to manage that uncertainty, taking a longer term view on return on investment in terms of your general planning approach, whether that's using a 2100 instead of a 2050 or 2070 outlook as some other caps in the Bay Area do for sea level rise. That would be an option. And then looking at updating and being able to have a method to update for best available state of science, as well as in general trying to build adaptive capacity for the district. Now, the how piece of this is what we'll get to with the next few slides. We'll kind of get through those in brief sequence here. But the first piece is, again, identifying, visualizing those vulnerabilities, looking at what potential scenarios or relative risk we're considering, and then again, prioritizing and working towards that roadmap for different strategies we may be able to employ over time. Well, not necessarily over time. What I will say is actually our focus is not specific to an exact year is exactly when you're going to implement a particular strategy. We're really looking at what kind of triggers, and we'll get to what that means in a moment, or a change in condition might prompt the district to be thinking about initiating a strategy. So just to add a clarification there. All right, when we're talking about visuals, we really do mean visuals. So this is a nifty visual that gives you sort of a watershed idea in cartoon form, if you will, for different vulnerabilities. So you'll see the sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, drought, et cetera. Our anticipation within this project is to create something that's a bit more tailored to the specific environmental situation and layout of the service area for ACWD within the watershed. And so this is just an example of sort of what that looks like in a tool to communicate to the public. In the next slide, what we're looking at is just a few examples, and I won't dwell on this too much. I think, to be perfectly honest, within just the group and that's on this call and what folks have brought up, we've really touched on quite a number of these. I would say nearly all of them, if not almost all of them. So I think we won't spend too much time here, but just to communicate, we understand that there are a range of potential impacts, and that the range of impacts also requires a range of different solutions. And so in part, when we're looking at identifying vulnerabilities and later matching potential strategies, we're also looking at what are some options where you have a strategy that can identify and help address multiple vulnerabilities. So just to communicate that with this slide here. On our next slide, this is really to communicate what are some of the parts of that identifying vulnerabilities process. We do have a data collection process we've already been engaging in. And I have been very thankful for the support of the staff team on this, back and forth also with GIS layers. We appreciate that very much. And it really helps us to try to paint a clear picture of what are the existing assets, critical assets, where are some of those, what we would call hotspot areas where you may have a combination or compound vulnerabilities that we can describe and identify within our risk matrix. And this also helps us in terms of understanding potential spatial distribution, at least as a baseline, and then be able to try to understand in the future in terms of a range of potential futures, how that might change. So this is just an example of of some of those. And I think we can, in moving to that next slide, we're building that information and we're using that as a foundation for what we populate within our risk matrix. So this is a relatively simple example of some of the standard elements you would see in a risk matrix. In this case, we're looking at the general risk description, and we're looking at when I say probability of occurrence here, it's not necessarily a specific interval. It may be a range of different options. So to your point, Director Weed, in looking at what are we documenting as our assumptions for some of these vulnerabilities, this is in part where we're going to be documenting some of those. Again, from a planning perspective, we want to make sure that we are being as transparent as possible for future planners to be able to pick up this work and keep it going over time and update it. What you'll see is the other components here. You're looking at the impacts of different vulnerabilities and the overall risk. And then there's a way that we try to translate that into a general risk score. So there's a normalization process of both more quantifiable, but also less tangible elements for those risks. And we pair that with a potential adaptation strategy, which can be thought of as a little bit higher level and a range of potential solutions to address those vulnerabilities. If we move on to that item number 3, when we talk about prioritizing those strategies themselves, we're also trying to think through what are some of the key criteria. And this is a point we're just coming up on for some back and forth here again. I know it's been a little bit of a monologue, so my apologies. But this slide here, we are looking at what are some potential evaluation criteria, and I will very much reiterate that this is just an example list, if you will, of what some of the criteria may be when we're thinking through, does the strategy address regulatory feasibility? Does it address physical risk? Is there an environmental benefit that could be derived? A lot of these can be more positive in terms of how they're weighted. There are some inverted, as you can see, costs or costs of inaction, for example. But those are some of the evaluation criteria we can think about when we're trying to understand what strategies we may want to prioritize or implement first prior to another. So there's a little pop-up here, and what we'd like to pause and ask the board. And I know that it's maybe hard to try to differentiate between different types of criteria, but as an exercise and food for thought, are there any criteria that you think are particularly important to consider when we're evaluating different strategies? Are there any that stand out to you, either maybe not covered in as much depth typically, or some that you'd like this team to take a further look at? So I'll pause there and open that up to the board members for comment for these criteria. Anything that may be missing, for example. And if you would like to unmic, I don't see any existing hands.
It looks like Director Reed might be trying to speak.
Muted. Is it open to the board? Is there any comment by member of the board?
From my end, I feel like this list is fairly comprehensive. I really like the fact that we've included cost of inaction as well, because I think that's really important for us to include. Only thing that I could potentially add to the community benefits would be potential water quality benefits. If there's, I think that there's always opportunities for that. But other than that, I think your list right now is fairly comprehensive.
So this is Judy. I definitely agree with Director Akbari. I guess I have a question. Where would water supply reliability fit in this list?
If I may maybe address it directly, the enhanced regional resilience is one area we considered the general supply reliability, because we would be thinking of supply out of the immediate vicinity of the service area, of course. However, if that's not as immediately apparent, that's a helpful feedback for us to consider whether or not to either tweak or add an additional criteria that if separate enough, would provide another important consideration. Thank you.
I would ask for it to be elevated, because this is a water district, and that is definitely something that's very important to us. I got the feeling it's buried in one of these criteria, but
in a few. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think it actually would be good to elevate it, just to give it its own standalone evaluation, since this is for business. Thank you.
Yeah, and one thing to add to that we were discussing too is, given that this climate adaptation plan as kind of one piece to feed into the overall IRP update process. I know as part of the IRP, the district will be evaluating different water supply options specifically around reliability. So this is kind of like one piece feeding into that. But we can certainly think about like how to weave those two together, whether they're distinctly separate or whether there's a way to weave that into this evaluation as well.
Yeah, just figure a way to build it in so it's apparent that it's considered.
Yeah.
I think that would be a better way to phrase it.
Great comment.
Could I suggest that you have at least a small section that identifies where we've had impacts from climate change and how it's impacted our operations currently? We've had an issue with algae, particularly at the Dyer Reservoir in the South Bay Aqueduct, which was at a level that we could not process the water. So we had to shut down our major treatment plant. We've had issues of water. A neighboring agency, Zone 7, has done a study within the watershed showing that the water is too warm to take the threatened and endangered species and support them. But yet we're spending money without regard to whether the water, even the habitat, is capable. And introducing species that are truly true predators to truly endangered species. We've gone down that path. So, but on where we've had climate change, the increased heat, the change in our needs for irrigation within the district is, and so I think we can quantify some and identify some of the climate impacts we've had currently. We've seen some limited level of sea level rise and some shoreline flooding. And then we might also show where they're in conflict with the regulations of neighboring agencies. Either in conflict or the neighboring agencies have just ignored the issue entirely. Thank you.
I have a question here from Director Sethi. It's really to staff. What is the cost of performing this study? And have we already made a board approval for the expenditure, or is it prospectively coming up?
The contract's been authorized with board approval several months ago. And the total dollar amount, I suppose, is public record, is approximately $120,000, which is right in the engineer's estimate for the project and the budget.
Okay, thank you.
We have a request from Kelly Abreu to, or Kelly A. He needs to be unmuted, I believe, in order to speak.
All right. Okay.
You're on.
Yeah, thank you. The when it comes to prioritizing adaptation strategies, well, the number one impact of climate change so far, if you look, is in your water demand forecast. They depend on the average summertime temperatures, and demand for water goes up supposedly when things get hotter. So that's going to be that is already happening, and it's been happening for the last couple of years, which have been hot years in the summertime. So climate adaptation, in my mind, goes hand in hand. The number one strategy for adaptation strategy, it ought to be demand management. And the last major drought, the state imposed urban water use restrictions, and now they're just, they're doing filibustering and talking about that, but they aren't really doing anything very serious in that direction. So I would look for a demand management policy that actually does manage demand instead of just talking about it. Right now we're talking about 15% conservation when in point of fact, water use is up 1% or 2% or whatever percent. So and we need a water demand management strategy that's equitable, that's flexible, that responds rapidly. And we have shown none of that in the last year or two, and neither has any other agency. If you look at all across the state, water use is up, 2.5% statewide as of January. It's so this agency needs one, but and we're in bad shape, but nobody else is doing any better when none of the urban agencies. Thanks.
All right, thank you. All right, do we have other comments from members of the board? There being none, I see we're into the prioritization of our strategies. I would also suggest that we discuss what I believe is a contingency situation with droughts, if those are episodic, and then give some general description of the best way to approach a episodic situation. I suggest both from a financial and an operational standpoint, desalination is far superior to recycled water. And unfortunately, we have recycled water in the current bar recommendation. So as we go down this path, we'll see what we've done. We've had great success with brackish desal. Thank you.
Thank you.
President Weed, if I could just chime in here, that was, I just wanted to point out that Kelly A did exactly what the public would need to do if they wanted to participate, which is he raised his hand and we're able to see that because public members can't unmute themselves. And so if any member of the public who's participating would like to make a comment, please raise your hand. We'll be monitoring that and provide you the opportunity to speak when it's appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
If there are no further comments, Director Reed, I'd recommend us continuing through the presentation, if that's all right.
All right, please go on to our next section.
Excellent. All right, so this is going to be a continuation a bit just for the next couple of slides on what we might see when we're thinking through what does it look like to prioritize different strategies. Now, what I will highlight here is that this is, again, a very general example. Of course, we're looking at, we're looking at just a general example of strategy 1 through 5 there, which I'm sure you can see is certainly a representation of a quite a nondescript example. And what you'll see on the bottom there is that we've got the same evaluation criteria we had on the previous slide. And that evaluation criteria really follows in that same order, and you can see that represented with the same colors up in the benefit score. So what we're looking at here is assigning a value to different benefits, being able to normalize those across those different parameters, and then be able to see how different strategies might perform with their relative benefit score. So just as an example of when using the decision support tools that we tend to use, and those are typically Excel-based, very much not black box, and is something we work with our clients on together and have in past projects. This is an example of what that output would look like. Now, if we go to the next slide, there's a different visualization that we can communicate here with how we're looking at general benefits to costs. And one of the things that we want to highlight here, and again, these are some sort of nondescript identifiers, again, emphasizing the example here, is that we've got a benefit score on one axis on that left-hand side, and then we've taken that cost out of that overall benefit score. And the reason for that is really to understand the benefits collectively and what that willingness to pay is for those collective benefits, instead of taking costs and measuring that against each benefit individually. So this is in part why we recommend trying to take that type of an approach and what that visualization really represents. And again, the reiteration here is trying to make sure that we're considering a full range of benefits for different strategies before weighing in on the very important, but a cost assumption that then comes later to be weighed against that collectively. So if we move on to the next slide, and this is getting us from understanding, again, what those strategies are, what we might be thinking about in terms of, okay, looking towards the future, how and when might we think about initiating some of those strategies? And again, we're not talking about a specific project per se. We're talking about what is the approach to try to manage a particular vulnerability once we reach a changing condition. And so here, what we're talking about with this number 4 is understanding what are some of the uncertainties that we're considering in the range of potential futures and how that might drive our scenario planning. When we're talking about scenario planning, we're looking at, we've come up with what are some of those strategies to address the existing vulnerabilities we're aware of and how that may change over time. And the change over time part of this, this approach is also looking at what are some of the uncertainties in the future and what might be some of those pivot points should something such as an environmental change occur. And we'll give an example of that in a moment here, but this is just to give a list of some of these. So for example, community needs is a non-physical, but you also have physical as well as the more ecological needs represented at the bottom there. If we go on to the next slide, and I think that one's a little more colorful, we are talking about just an example. This is a very high level representation of what we mean when we're talking about the words trigger or strategy implementation. And you'll notice we don't have an estimated year on the bottom. That's really to communicate that this is something that would be occurring. We know that time progresses, but it's not a fixed year. It's going to be at a change in condition. So at a trigger, for example, a certain degree of saltwater intrusion, we might think about what are some of the different activities that we could put in process and what do those look like. So for example, if your adaptation strategy was centered on minimizing saline intrusion to maintain reliable groundwater resources as a general umbrella strategy addressing certain vulnerabilities, some of the options, the ABC that you might reach when you get to a certain level of saltwater intrusion are going to be those examples you see on the side there. And whether or not to initiate one of those, multiple, that is something that we would be evaluating looking at some of those scenarios. And again, that reiteration of no regrets. And for those who are not as familiar with that parlance, the no regrets is a descriptor for different measures, policies, actions that may be put in place that should an event that you're anticipating, whether that be a severe drought event, whether that be a severe storm, for example, should that event not occur, do you still derive a benefit from what you're implementing? So those are, and another piece of that is associated with cost in terms of the low regrets as well. So just to give a brief overview of that one. If we move on to the very next slide, and I'm going to reiterate here, there are a number of items we're going to click to populate some of this. If we start just kind of slowly clicking through those, this is a general example, and you can keep clicking through. It's quite animated, so we're going to see an example of a general shoreline infrastructure approach here. What you'll see at the bottom are different changing conditions, and we're looking at some examples from NOAA sea level rise viewer as a general reference. So again, this is very general, not saying specific to ACWD service area, and there's a reference for some very useful resources at the bottom from NOAA. You'll see that at different points of a changing condition, you're looking at different, and this would be something, a very specific action and potentially project you'd be putting in place, but you'll see that this is very trigger driven, not a specific year. And so you'll see there's a time to prepare. You'll note that there's a trigger incidence and that has been agreed upon beforehand. And there's essentially a contingency plan to be put in place and is carried out when that trigger is reached. So again, this is a very general example, but it's just to kind of show what we're talking about when we think about pathway planning and triggers using a general example. Now, when we switch to this next slide here, I will say it does say next steps, but we're not completely done yet. We've got the board Q&A and the public input at the end here. So I don't want folks to feel like they're not going to have their voice heard, because there is opportunity after that. We've only got one more slide here. And that next steps, there's just 2 clicks there, the continued work, and then also what's coming up. And so our continued work really focuses on integrating feedback that we've heard from all of you from this workshop, continuing to develop that vulnerability assessment and work that into the risk assessment and that draft risk matrix that we talked about earlier. And then the upcoming deliverables are really focused on, being that this is a 6-month project for phase 1, is really focusing on developing that comprehensive CAP and also providing a summary to be used as an informational resource for the public to help support the future engagement as well. So I will pause there. That brings the majority, or I would say the totality of the general content slides to a close. We can go to that next slide here. And what we had anticipated for the end of this presentation was continued board Q&A, and we do want to make sure that we're allowing adequate time for public input as well. So I will pause there, and Director Weed, I will ask if you and the other directors may have comments or questions you may like to ask or share.
Fine. First, let me invite any member of the public that wishes to comment to raise their hand. Well, I don't see any. Do we have any member of the board that wishes to make a comment? Don't see it. Oh, then let me make a couple. I would ask that you look at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission study on climate adaptation. They also included in that a business case. They presented this both to the SFPC board or commission and also at the AWWA Research Center in Denver. It shows a slide, much like your chart of some of the various options, and showed a cost going up to $35 a unit, which is $15,200 an acre foot, without any identification of what that would be. If we look at what they used to fund their WISP program, which was $2, funded $6 billion of construction, or $2 per unit. That would be a $90 billion capital construction project for climate adaptation. I don't think they have that anywhere in their mindset, but how they got to $35 a unit, 7 times the current cost, the highest cost water supply in the United States, would be informative.
Mm.
And make sure we don't make the same, or if we do make the same judgment calls, at least tell us what they are. Thank you.
I appreciate that example. Thank you. And thank you for sharing the example on the screen as well.
So is there any other comment by members of the board? When your chart on flood heights or flood walls, there's something called an ecotone levee. There's a model for that now at Loma. They've had people fly in from the East Coast. It is a massive bay fill project, but it is a way to address sea level rise and also how to deal with the effluent from the numerous sanitary treatment facilities around the bay. So again, I encourage you to put that in as one of the, identify that as one of the potential and discussed climate adaptations that we could do in this area. It wouldn't be in our pocket yet, but who knows? Thank you.
Somebody will make a note of that one as well.
City of Fremont, about a year ago, had the zoning administrator approve an 802,000 square foot office building at the intersection of Route 84 and Paseo Padre, with elevations of 7 feet for the parking areas. FEMA has identified 11 feet that may go to 14 feet for sea level rise. That did not go to council or to any of the planning commissions. That was done by a zoning administrator. So those are some of the challenges you run into when you try to deal with the large amount of development. And we'll be putting infrastructure into what will clearly be saturated soils. What are the implications to our district if we have to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Director Sethi. I have one other comment I'd like to provide some input on. I asked earlier in the meeting if we could take a look at maybe making a proposal for a regional effort toward looking at some of these problems. But the more I think about it, and you may want to explore this, I'm not saying you have to, but you may wish to, is what is the role of the state of California in considering what the impact is to the Bay Area and, let's say, San Diego, Long Beach, other areas that are critical to international commerce? You know, all of our ports, all of the commerce that occurs, the centrality of Silicon Valley as a real economic force, not only for the state, but the country. I would think if I were a state legislator, I would start thinking about how do we protect our state? And we're at the ground level here talking about concerns within our own community. But I would think that at some point this has to be thought out more globally, that we have a state climate adaptation policy that we need to adopt, and that it has something of regional enforcement across the state. And most of us will not be on the board 10, 20, 30 years from now. And so I think we need to inform future boards of directors and future planning staff, you know, what's the right way to go about solving this problem? And it's not that I object, but I seem to think that if everybody's fighting with their own claws in their own little backyard, that you don't achieve a whole lot in the long run. That this has to be thought out from the governor's office on down through the legislature. And frankly, Director Weed and I are going to a water conference this weekend, leaving tomorrow, and I have to tell you, even at the aqua level, I don't hear this being talked about. So those are some good questions I hope you will explore and help better inform us of what are the practical solutions. And maybe at some point we have to lobby our own elected legislators, statewide and federally, to help with solving a common problem.
If I may add on to Director Sethi, I think hopefully this will give us some of that ammunition we need, and some backing. We're looking at it, and this is somewhat regional in that we cover 3 cities. We can't hide the regional aspect in this study, and I think this might give us that ammunition. We could go and take that ability to go forward with some documents and some plans and some concepts, maybe, and not mitigation, but this is what's going to happen, and we got to deal with it. And I hope that's how we could take this. And I agree that by doing this, take it to Aqua. Say, Aqua, look what we've got here. This is saying we got to do something, and this is why we have to do it. It doesn't say what we have to do, but it's why. And so I think that's a good idea, Director Sethi, and this hopefully will help us do that. I think it will.
All right, thank you. Other board members? I'll make a note that earlier this week, the governor made an announcement that they had endorsed and were implementing voluntary agreements. 3 days later, yesterday, it came out that that did not include the Tuolumne River or the San Francisco PUC facilities. They're still under unimpaired flows. So there are advantages to getting this documented and promoted as easy for what the impacts are and what we have to address. But beware. Right, so far we have not, we've been given the short end of the stick on a number of issues, and this is the latest. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Is there any other items before related to this workshop that we need to discuss? All right. Then there's nothing else before the board. I would thank the you for your presentation, and look forward to the next round.
We thank you for the opportunity to present and for all of the helpful input. We've taken quite a number of notes, so we appreciate that very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much to our presenters and for all the hard work you guys have put into this so far. And I know there's quite a bit more to do. And And we've given you more to think about. So I know that, and I know you will. So that is all for the workshop item, Director President Weed. We do have one other item on the agenda. It's a general manager's report.
Oh, please. All right. Thank you. You're going to tell us it's dry.
I think you already know it's dry, but this is a quick report on the governor's recent executive order related to the drought and the district's drought response. And so, Ms. Sue, if I could ask you to please pull up that item. Thank you. So this is an item that actually Director Sethi suggested that we place on the agenda to take a quick look at the governor's executive order and what the district has been doing with regard to the drought and how this executive order may or may not impact the drought or the district. So I thought I'd start out with the next slide with a quick recap. Thank you. Of some of the sort of major milestones that have occurred during this drought. I won't go into all kinds of detail on these, but you may recall that ACWD started our intensive One Saves Water campaign back in May of last year. And that's also when ACWD adopted our water shortage contingency plan. And of course, that all followed, an exceptionally dry, rainy season on top of a dry 2020. So also in May, the governor declared a water shortage emergency in Alameda County. And then in July, the governor declared requested voluntary conservation from all Californians to equal 15%, to get to a 15% water use reduction from the prior year. And then in October, the governor declared a statewide water shortage emergency. And then SFPUC declared their water shortage emergency in December. And then at about the same time, the state announced a 0% allocation from the state water project to affect the state water contractors, including ACWD. So largely as a result of those water supply constraints due to the ever increasing drought, the district, we declared our own water shortage emergency. We declared a stage 2 water shortage emergency on December 9. And as part of that, we adopted our water shortage emergency ordinance, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But important to recognize here is that the district, we declared a stage 2 water shortage emergency, and therefore we implemented stage 2 of our water shortage contingency plan. So finally, in February, the district adopted our water shortage emergency stage rates at the stage 2A level. And that was to match a 15% needed additional conservation or water use reduction. And so that equated to a 15% additional surcharge on the volumetric side of the water bill. And so those rates became effective on March 1st. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just some reminders about our water shortage emergency ordinance. The ordinance includes provisions and restrictions consistent with the stage 2 of our water shortage contingency plan. So it includes mandatory restrictions and prohibitions on water use, including some key restrictions that are shown here. Restricting the number of days of spray irrigation per week, prohibitions on irrigating within 2 days of a measurable rainfall event. And then there's a number of other provisions in the ordinance prohibiting irrigation of turf and street medians and other restrictions. So the ordinance also includes enforcement steps and more guidelines for water use efficiency. Next slide, please. Okay, so now turning to the governor's executive order. So its key provisions are to direct the state water board to consider adopting emergency regulations within the next 2 months, and they're to require urban water suppliers to implement stage 2 of their water shortage contingency plans. So, that sounds very familiar by now. And also to ban irrigation of non-functional turf in essentially every land use other than residential, recreational, municipal parks, and so forth. The executive order also includes a number of other directives related to permitting of hauled water, protection of groundwater supplies and wildlife, and preventing illegal water diversions, and then requiring additional reporting of supplies and demands, essentially moving up the schedule of normal water supply and demand reporting to the state. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what is ACWD doing relative to the executive order? So because we are already in a declared stage 2 water shortage emergency, and because we've already implemented stage 2 of our water shortage emergency or water shortage contingency plan, the order doesn't have an immediate effect on ACWD. And the key here is that we've already been out in front of this. But it's important to note that this was a directive to the water board to develop these emergency regulations. And so we are obviously going to be watching the regulatory process, and we'll of course engage as appropriate. But we're also doing other things that we've been working on anyway, but they'll be handy in this situation. And that is to continue to work on ramping up our public outreach. Importantly, we're trying to see if we can get a little bit more coordination across the Bay Area on common or at least coordinated messaging to minimize confusion out there. We recognize that's a real problem, and providing simple and clear and consistent messaging to all of the water users in the Bay Area. That's the goal. I think the governor's order actually gives us a good opportunity to do that. It's made a pretty big splash. It's an opportunity to point out to our sister agencies throughout the Bay Area that we're all in the same boat. We're similarly situated, and we could all benefit from some coordinated messaging. Of course, we continuously assess our water supply conditions, the Niles Cone, stored water, water available from the state, and that together with demand conditions. And we will advise the board if a higher water shortage, water emergency stage becomes appropriate. If that's the case, if we need to move from stage 2 to some other higher stage, that would require additional board action to either amend or pass a new ordinance, because our current ordinance is specific to stage 2. And that would also open the door to changing our water shortage emergency stage rate as well. But that again would require additional board action. Next slide, please. Oh, that's it. Okay. So with that, I just wanted to provide that quick update. This has been, it's a big news issue. And again, Director Sethi suggested it be put on the agenda in case there's any questions, discussion. We wanted to make sure that we were sort of fully informing the board and the public as to what's going on following the executive order. That completes my general manager's report.
All right, thank you. Is there any board question or comment? Thought, in the last drought, the governor's office apparently, as I recall, went one step further and started identifying individual districts with specific restrictions, limitations, and we would just anxiously wait for the next chart that came out to decide how much more we had to conserve by state directive. That is, we're not there yet, correct?
That's correct. With the last drought, the administration applied specific target reductions across the state. Here, the governor did, I think, something a lot different. I think the state learned from the last drought. We implemented the state required water shortage contingency plans to be developed, right? And so all of the major larger urban water agencies had to develop those and be prepared for a drought situation. So that's very much different than the way it was before the prior drought. So in this case, I will tell you the governors, the administration certainly was evaluating lots of alternatives as to how to address the increasing drought severity. And at this point has decided that rather than mandating a certain % reduction, rather than doing that, to require that certain stage of the various water shortage contingency plans be implemented. And so that's a very big difference between this drought and the last. And I will tell you that there was a lot of effort between the water industry and the administration to help them understand the ramifications of those various avenues and to encourage the governor to not do what was done in 2015, which was sort of more of a one-size-fits-all. Everybody's got to reduce water demands by a specific amount, given that there's so much variability between agencies and water suppliers in terms of their unique local conditions, different supplies, different settings, different demands, and so forth. So it's very different than what was done in 2015.
Well, let me add to that, Mr. Stevenson, that as much as I admire Governor Brown, he did hit everybody over the head with a sledgehammer back in 2015, whereas I think Governor Newsom learned from that exercise that one size doesn't fit all, especially when we have so many different hydrological regions in California. And so he's using a rubber mallet right now to kind of tap us on the head and say, do the best that you can given the circumstances you're in. Here's a couple of reasons why I wanted to bring this out in a public meeting tonight. One is just to recap the governor's executive order. But number two, as I mentioned to you, when I drive around some of the industrial parks in Union City, North Fremont, and South Fremont, everybody's lawns are green in all the commercial areas, and they've got their sprinklers running even when it's raining. And it seems like we need a much better effort outreach to the large industrial companies and commercial parks. I'm not really picking on the small businesses in our community who have very little landscaping in comparison. But that's an area of opportunity that I think we really need to reach out. And these are management companies that employ people for their landscaping that are not even attached to the corporation that is leasing the property. So These are very complicated relationships that you're dealing with. And I know that Laura Heides and her team, they have the graphic information to determine exactly the number of square feet per location or parcel lot. So that's an area of opportunity. And number two, I thought this would be an opportunity to highlight, if we don't conserve enough right now, with every unit being charged 78 cents more per unit, what's the next level if we have to go to a stage 3 that we should alert the community about? Because I think that creates an incentive that we don't want to go there. We don't want to see this at $1.25 a unit or something.
Yeah, so I think you raise a few really good points. One of the things we've been talking about is using this executive order as a way to amp up that messaging. And so you mentioned the commercial industrial customers and the landscaping and so forth. Well, those emergency regulations don't exist yet. However, we've been talking about, sending letters to those folks that we need to serve, industrial, commercial, and institutional properties. We have that account information. We have a fair idea about the degree to which their irrigation is turf versus other landscapes. And so we've been planning to sort of parse through available information and then send information out to these folks to let them know that this is included in the governor's order, and they may wish to prepare for prohibition on irrigating that turf. And sort of as a courtesy to our customers, but also in a way that would potentially help them reduce their water use now.
Oh, let me note that rate-based conservation is not the mechanism for achieving conservation. It's through public relations. Regional media far better and stronger than others. We were part of the study that showed tiered rates had little influence in the amount of conservation. And we had 100% compliance. So when we asked people to cut back on their water, but it's not based on rates. The reason for staged rates is to cover the drop in revenue when people do conserve. It's purely a financial play. So that's my take.
Are we driving in the same vehicle to the conference tomorrow, John?
One of the great frauds of our time is rate-based conservation.
We're going to have a good debate on the drive.
Want to bring a recorder with you, Paul? This would be fun.
Okay, thank you. Is there any comment by members of the board?
I'd like to thank Director Sethi for bringing this up. I think, you know, I saw that too. And I remember that during our rate hearings and a lot of the comments were, we're not in a drought. It's raining. That was in December. Great timing. And yeah, it was raining. Matter of fact, it rained just last week. It was great. It was glorious. But it didn't rain January at all. It didn't rain February basically either. And so it's difficult to get a message out when December was, you know, pretty darn good. October was crazy. And we just had a nice storm. But yeah, it's bad. And I think it's difficult sometimes for the public to see that. So the more we put it out, the more we message. You know, we're going into summer. We probably won't see much rain in the near future. I mean, I wish we would. It's still April, May. But messaging is going to be very difficult. But I think we have to take that into account, that you know, it is difficult because of what happened in December. And thank God for what happened in December. But I appreciate this coming on to the meeting tonight. I think the more we message, we're going to have to. We're going to have to keep that message out there because it's easy for people to forget. They still remember December. What they forget is January and February, March.
We have one, Mr. Ken Nishimura wishes to address the board.
Yeah, I mean, now that we've moved on to the public's reaction to the drought, I guess I'm going to just pile on and get back to something I've mentioned to the board before, which still irritates me, you know, is installation of large amounts of new grass. The most egregious, of course, is that new campsite owned by East Bay Regional near the same intersection where I think Director Weed, you mentioned that the city approved an 890,000 square foot office complex. You know, given the fact that the district is paying people $2 a square foot to remove lawn, it may require the district to consider an inverse fee for anybody that is putting in new lawn commensurate to that amount. Because if I just did a quick calculation of that new lawn that the East Bay Regional Park installed at that campsite, it basically undoes a good fraction of what the district has been able to achieve with the lawn conversion program. So on one hand, we're sitting here trying to message to try to get people to convert lawns to drought tolerant. And on the other hand, we have, in this case, a sister governmental agency trying to undo that at breakneck speed. And I think that, as long as the public sees large amounts of new grass being installed, the messaging is going to be mixed. Yeah, it's okay to go ahead and water your lawn and install new lawn. So I think something needs to be done to prevent that kind of new installation, at least within the district boundary. Thank you.
Thank you. I know it's 805,000 square feet, but thank you. Other members of the board who wish to comment? All right, there being none, thank you very much for the presentation. And next, move on to item 7, if that completes the general manager's report.
Yes.
Director's comments or agenda request? If there are none, we can then move to adjournment.
I do see Mr. Nishimura's hand up. I don't know if it's still up from before or if it's a new. Okay.
Mr. Is it down now?
It's down now.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, thank you, and thank you, Ms. Sprague and the Brown Caldwell representatives that were here for the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, good meeting. Good night, everybody.
Very much. Good night.